Thank you all so very much. What a beautiful introduction, and how honored I am to be introduced by someone who I have such tremendous respect for, our Mrs. T, as we know her in the Texas legislature. Every single legislative session, she brings the fight, and I have been lucky enough and smart enough to fight alongside her. I was especially proud to fight alongside her when she led the drive for equal pay for equal work in the House. And with God's grace, if I have the opportunity to become our state's next governor, I will proudly sign her bill into law next session. To President Little and your executive director, Mrs. Smith, to the phenomenal women who are being honored here tonight, Mrs. Audrey Hoffman-Lawson, Mrs. Karen Eubanks Johnson, Mrs. Sharon Michael Owens. And we pay homage to the heroes for whom these awards are named, the NAACP presidents, past and present, who've courageously led this organization, and the late Congressman Mickey Leland, who used his life not only to create a stronger Texas, but a better world. And to the NAACP's members and friends, I can't tell you how much of a humbling honor it is to be here with all of you this evening. When I was walking out of the door of my hotel room this evening, I was on the phone with my daughter, and she asked me, "Where are you going tonight, Mom?" And I said, "To church." And when I was being, of course, a little lighthearted in my response, in so many ways, I mean it, because the work of this organization truly is God's work. The NAACP has become synonymous with social justice. If it had not been for you, we would not have a public defender's office in Harris County today. If it had not been for you fighting to reduce over-reliance on incarceration, fighting against discriminatory redistricting maps, fighting against so much in the way of voter suppression, so many Texans wouldn't even be able to vote today. If it had not been, throughout history, mothers and fathers, saints and sinners, organizers and activists and advocates, sung and unsung, have cried those words in raw, heartfelt testimonies of hard-fought victory. I heard many of those testimonies a few months back when I had one of the most amazing experiences and privileges in my life. I had the opportunity to attend the LBJ Civil Rights Summit in Austin in celebration and recognition of the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And as I sat there listening to giants and bravery and determination, the Reverend Bernice King reading her father's letter from the Birmingham jail, Mavis Staples singing about how she'd marched up Freedom's highway and how she'd made up her mind that she wouldn't turn around, I thought to myself, they never doubted the power of their own voices. And then I thought about my own story, about how at 19 I was raising my little girl on my own and I was broke. I was just always broke. How on so many days I would ration frozen pizzas just to try to make our food last for a week. Too many nights I would come home from my second job and lie awake at night praying for an answer to how I would pay my bills. How I was angry and frustrated that I'd let my life get so off track and not knowing how to put it back on course. But what I didn't see then was that throughout the history of our nation, Americans had not just put destiny back on course, we had changed that course when it needed to be done. Like when lunch counters and buses and ballots were luxuries that you had to march for and sit in for, and those giants of the civil rights movement risked everything and feared nothing to change our nation's course. We had always been able to see that our futures and the future of our community were all wrapped up together, that my struggle was your struggle, that your struggle was mine. So even though I was frustrated with myself about not making it in college, I didn't give up until I found a way to change course. And when I did, I held on to it with the passion of someone who knew what it was like to see it slip away time and time again. I enrolled in Tarrant County Community College, and it took literally every bit of the strength that I had to work 2 jobs, go to school, raise a child, but I was too afraid, honestly, to let up. I was worried that if I stopped, it would all fall apart again. So I kept working until I could transfer to TCU and rise to the top of my class there. When it was finally time for me to apply to law school, just filling out the applications was a dream come true for me. And when I got into Harvard Law School, I knew that the Texas promise was real and that my story was the embodiment of that promise. And I'm telling you my story not because it's unique, but exactly because it isn't. My whole life, I have seen Texans create better lives for themselves and their families, something that's much harder to see today because we live in a state that makes it so much harder today. But the fact of the matter is, it should not be. It shouldn't be the exception that a student can make her way up and out of poverty through education. It should be the rule. But 50 years after the poll tax, 50 years after the Civil Rights Act, and 60 years after separate but equal, we're at a moment in history where insiders are rehashing old battles that those giants of the civil rights and workers' rights and women's rights have already waged and fought and won. We're seeing the subtle and pernicious unwinding of that work. We're celebrating anniversaries while others are working to tear down our progress. We live in a state that discriminates against its own citizens with a voter ID suppression law so backwards that a federal court recently called it the modern-day version of a poll tax. We live in a state that has said it's okay for rape kits to sit untested on evidence room shelves around this state for years, that says it's okay to pay women $8,000 a year less on average than men, and African American women just 59 cents on the dollar. We live in a state where women's access to health care has been cut short or cut off to the point that it's literally endangered women's health throughout this state. But here's the thing, where we fail women, we fail our families. And where we fail our families, we fail our very future. From the inequity in education, to the dismantlement of the Voting Rights Act, to reinstating the poll tax through a harsh photo ID law and the shuttering of women's health centers. The battle lines may have shifted. The injustices may be subtler, quieter, but they're no less destructive than they were 50 years ago. And the need for folks to come together and to organize communities, to stand up and to speak out for what they believe is right is as necessary now as it has ever been. And one great thing that we do in America, especially in Texas, is that we celebrate our history and our triumphs. But so often when we do, we act as though the worst is behind us, as though the trouble is over, and justice and equality, once rallying cries that inspired freedom songs and sparked protests and stirred some folks so much so until they just kneel and pray and weep, the rallying cry for justice and equality have become almost abstract for some people. They've become words that we say when we want to sound passionate, but many of us have become so desensitized to their true power, which suggests, on the one hand, that justice and equality have pervaded our culture, which is a fantastic thing. But on the other hand, it suggests that we've used the words too many times without connecting them to the actions that folks have started to see them as words alone. Which one it actually is can only be determined by each of us in our own hearts. Are we doing all that we can to advance justice and equality? Or do we talk a good game? Because right now, instead of moving forward, progress appears to be sliding back down the arc of history, knocking down gains and leaving behind a trail of injustice. And we see that wreckage every day. Juliet Stepesh, the president of the Education Board here in Houston, came to one of my events, and she talked about a student who had done everything that his teachers had asked of him and more, but he was still reading under grade level because his school didn't have the resources to give him the education that he needed. That is an injustice. It's an injustice when schools have to either cut teachers or cut programs, cutting support for our children either way. It's an injustice when children cannot realize their dreams and get trapped instead in a pipeline to prison. It's an injustice when predominantly minority school districts receive less and less funding in comparison to other districts. It's an injustice, and it's not right. In 2013, a student taking 15 hours at a public university paid twice as much for tuition as a student who took the same number of hours only a decade before. The pace of college enrollment has slowed, and Texas ranks 30th in the nation in the percentage of adults with at least a bachelor's degree. That's where we are right now. Every single person here tonight knows that there can be no justice without equality. But what fosters equality? You and me, us. We do it by raising the minimum wage so that people can earn a decent wage, not just because it's a fairness issue, but because it's a family issue. No one can support a family on $15,000 a year, and no one should be asked to. We do it together by fighting to expand Medicaid. We do it by investing more in education and making sure that every 4-year-old can have full-day quality pre-K. And we fight for that not only because their future depends on it, but because our future depends on it. And taking our schools to court and bleeding them dry is not conservative, it's not liberal, it's just dumb. We do that. We do it all by voting. by giving people rides to the polls, by making sure that every single person that we know understands the power of their voices and their vote, and the centuries of pain and heartache that went into securing that right, that privilege, that sacred obligation. That is the charge that we have to keep. So I'm calling on each of us to do more. And I know that we will answer that call because we always do. We've seen it in the sacrifices of generations past when women revolutionized the workforce in America, fueled the civil rights movement, and fought quiet battles as maids and cooks and secretaries so that our daughters could someday become doctors and lawyers and elected officials and CEOs. And I see it throughout this room right now in all of you, all who've come together despite party or politics because you believe like I do, that no matter who you are, no matter what you look like or where you come from, that should not determine how far you can go. Because you believe like I do, that we have a responsibility to make sure that every single one of our sons and daughters can stand in a room just like this one day and say, I made it. My state believed in me. My state did not write me off. Because you believe like I do, that if we don't accept that responsibility, then nothing else matters. Decades ago, before Lulu White became executive secretary of this branch, the first woman in the South to hold such a position, before she led this chapter to become the second largest in the nation and inspired a historian to write of her, Lulu was the NAACP, and the NAACP was Lulu. Before she helped set the precedent for Brown versus Board by convincing Herman Sweat to become a plaintiff in Sweat v. Painter and integrate the University of Texas in 1950, she was a teacher. She was a teacher who believed in lifting as we climb. She understood that education and opportunity and equality are inextricably and irrevocably linked. And she dedicated her life not only to strengthening that bond, but to making sure that our state and our nation gave every single human being a fair shot at it. If it had not been for Lulu White, if it had not been for Christia Adair, if it had not been for everyday heroes who faced hard decisions and long odds but kept fighting because they'd do anything to give their family a chance at a better life, we would not have the rights that we have today. And we must honor their sacrifice because we face a moment where our children and our grandchildren will either one day say, if it had not been, or instead will say, why didn't they? The rights that giants of history fought for are at stake. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? The eyes of the nation are literally upon us. They're watching. They're watching to see if we will stand up for ourselves in this election and speak out for what we know is right in the face of voter suppression and a poll tax. They're watching to see what message we'll send to the world about our values, our will, and the power of our own voices. So if you believe like I do, that we can make Texas even greater, our communities stronger, that we can invest in our sons and our daughters and build an economy that leads this nation and the world, then join me and go vote. And when we do, every single hero, sung and unsung, who didn't make it here with us tonight, will be watching from on high November 4th. And they will see, this nation will see, the world will see, a Texas and her people take destiny and greatness into our hands, grip the arc of the moral universe and bend it until mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts can have the dignity of knowing that they can support themselves and their families on a fair and decent wage, until women are paid what they've earned and can go to the doctor without the government sitting in on their exams, until every child, no matter what they look like or where they come from, can live out the promise of this great state, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And when we do that, when we show the nation who we are in just 5 days, we will have won more than just the war. We will have won peace. God bless you all, and thank you so much for having me tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.